Good morning, YouTube. Good afternoon, depending where you are. I know I'm here on the sunny Gold Coast, Queensland, but I have a very special guest with me, and that is none other than Mr. Steve Rosen, the author of Tonechaser, Understanding Edward, my 26-year journey with Edward Van Halen. So I believe it's a good afternoon to you, Steve. Thanks for your time today, mate. I think this should be an interesting conversation because, as the title of your book says, you spent 26 years hanging out with the king, EVH, in order to write your... Yes.
EVH.
Yep. In order to write your book. And firstly, I just want to know, how did you originally meet Edward Van Halen?
So we need to go back just a little bit earlier than that, Rick. Let me just give you a little bit of background. So I became sort of a music journalist. I began writing actually probably late 1972. So by the time I had met Edward in July of 77, and I met him one night at the Whiskey, the famous club in Hollywood on the Sunset Strip, Cheap Trick were recording a live record. So I was there to watch them record this live record. I thought that would be very cool. So by the time I met Edward in July 77, I'd already been writing for about 4 years. So I'd been writing a lot for, by then I was sort of Guitar Player magazines. I was like their main freelancer at that point.
Oh, cool.
I had done, gosh, I don't know, a couple dozen stories for them. Cover stories. I'd already done a cover story on Jeff Beck. I think there was one on John Entwistle, Wishbone Ash. I mean, I'd interviewed some heavy people by the time I met him in 77.
Nice.
So that's a little bit of background. So I'm there at the Whiskey, and the girl who booked the club, Michelle Meyer, was a friend of mine. I had a band back in the day called Deluge. And we were a local band, and I'd written some originals, and we were kind of playing around. And she booked me into some of these other clubs that she was booking. Most famously, Madame Wong's East, which was at that time, a pretty hip punk club. A lot of really big punk bands came out of Madame Wong's East. I was not, my band was not a punk band, but she booked us there, and she never asked us to audition, and I owed her and I loved her, and Michelle had her finger on the pulse of everything that was happening in Hollywood. So I'm standing downstairs waiting for Cheap Trick to come on. I'm there with my younger brother, Mick, and there's a tap on my shoulder, and it's Michelle. And she says, listen, there's somebody upstairs I want you to meet. So I thought, if Michelle wants me to meet somebody, this has to be somebody worth meeting. She knew I was a guitar geek guy. I was writing for the guitar magazines, and, you know, so anybody she wanted me to meet, I just assumed was going to be somebody cool. So we walk up these stairs to the famous Whiskey dressing rooms, and there in the corner is this tall, lanky guy smoking a cigarette. And so you have to understand that this is July 1977. Their first record would not come out for another 8 months. Right, so that first record wouldn't come out until February 78. They had played around town. They had the deal on Warner Brothers, but nobody really knew that much about them. They knew that there was a band from Pasadena, and now they were playing the Whiskey, blah, blah, blah. But it's not like there were all these articles and photos, of the band. So
sure.
I'm pretty certain I recognized this guy standing there. But I try to rack my brain. Did I recognize him? Did I not recognize him? I think I recognized him. Maybe through seeing flyers. They used to, put flyers on all the lampposts and trees when they were playing a gig all the way up and down Sunset Boulevard.
Yeah.
So we go in and we walk over to this guy standing in the corner smoking a cigarette. And Michelle says, Steve Rosen, Eddie Van Halen. Eddie Van Halen, Steve Rosen. And, we kind of shake hands, and I'm thinking, yeah, Eddie Van Halen. I had heard about Van Halen, of course. Now, the other key point here is I had never seen Van Halen perform before meeting Edward. All I knew about the band was they'd gotten a monster deal on Warner Brothers Records. They were like the first of the local scene bands to get a major label deal. So I figured, my God, they got a deal on Warner Brothers Records. They have to be an amazing band. This guy has to be an incredible guitar player. But that's all I knew. So we start talking, and somehow the conversation lands on Eric Clapton. I was a massive Clapton fan, you know. I knew a lot about Eric, and going all the way back, certainly to Blind Faith and Cream, John Mayall, but pre John Mayall, he was in a bunch of these blues bands, and I knew about all of that stuff, So I was actually kind of a Clapton snob. So if I'm talking to you, and you make a comment about Eric Clapton that I deem is below my intellectual threshold of what you should know about Eric Clapton, you're dismissed. I'm sorry, Rick. That's a dumb question.
I get it. I get it.
Yeah. I wasn't that bad, but I knew a lot about Clapton, and I expected you to know as much if you're going to bring him up in a conversation.
Sure.
It was that type of thing.
Yep.
So we start talking, and not that I wanted him to bring him, talk about him and say something stupid, but I was waiting for it. But it was just the opposite. Edward may not have known about the history of Eric like I did, but he understood his playing in a way that even I didn't get. Like I said, I'm a guitar player. I was never a great guitar player, but I was good enough to understand guitar players and what they did and why they did it, and how they were writing riffs, blah blah blah. So he started talking about Eric's sound and the Marshall and his finger vibrato and this deep dive stuff, and I'm thinking, wow, this guy understands all this stuff that I don't, and I thought that was just the greatest. Then we jumped to Jeff Beck, who's another one of my favorite guitar players. In fact, my favorite guitar player of all time. We talked about Ritchie Blackmore. I asked him about the deal on Warner Brothers, and he goes, "Yeah, we got this deal on Warner's, and I think we made a good record, and I hope people like the record." Well, I'll tell you, man, if it was my band who had just scored a monster deal on Warner Brothers record, and you asked me, I would have said, "Are you kidding me? We got a deal on Warner Brothers Records, and you don't. We just made the greatest record since, Sgt. Pepper." So, but he was like that, and he would always be like that. He would never talk about himself or the band or his playing like, "Oh my God, was that the greatest solo I ever played?" Or "No one plays like me." He never ever talked like that. He never talked about himself that way. So that was the first meeting. So we're there talking, and he runs out of the room, and I'm kind of standing there, and he comes back and he's got a pen, and he picks up a piece of paper off the floor and is writing something down. He hands it to me, and it's numbers, and it's his phone number. He goes, "Man, I really enjoyed talking to you, and I hope we can talk again. Call me sometime." I thought, my God, this is unbelievable. Fast forward 8 months, February 1978, I was on Warner Brothers' list. Being on the list for a record company, you received all of their new releases every month. So I was receiving new releases from Warner's, Capitol, MCA, RCA, Elektra. One of the perks of being a poverty-stricken, freelance rock journalist was you got all these free records. So I remember getting the shipment for February, and I remember there was a record by, I think there was a Manfred Mann record in there. There was a record by the Rhoads. That was that Beatles takeoff that some of the Monty Python guys, it was like this takeoff on the Beatles called the Rhoads. There was a Little Feat record, and there's this Van Halen record. And I'm, opening the box, and I'm, oh my gosh, there's that guy, on the cover had the four photographs, there's that guy, Eddie Van Halen, that I met. I want to put this record on. So I put it on, and, this is back in the day of vinyl, my little record player, my little receiver and amplifier, and the needle comes down, and, the first track, gong, 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 down, 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 Running with the Devil. I thought, yeah, that's pretty cool. That's pretty cool. And then I kind of did some needle drops around, and I kind of heard it, and I thought, it's okay. It's it didn't blow me away. I wanted to be blown away. I
Sure.
was expecting this guy to be, the second coming of Jeff Beck and Hendrix and Page and David Gilmour, because those are all the people that I grew up on. I mean, I saw all those concerts. I saw Jeff Beck with the Rod Stewart Band in '68, and I saw The Who in '66, and I saw Free and Blind Faith, and I saw Cream, and I saw Hendrix twice. So that was my threshold, And if you weren't as good as those guys, well, you just weren't as good as those guys. I wasn't going to make up anything for you,
Sure.
to compensate. So I was expecting to be blown away. And I wasn't, to be honest with you. But then I thought, you know what? Everybody else I've spoken to said, this guy is going to change electric guitar. The band's going to be huge. I thought, okay, I've got to be missing something. So I went back the next day, made a big cup of coffee, sat down, and listened really carefully. And as I'm going through, I'm going, oh, that's what I missed the first time around. There's that sound. There's that touch and his picking technique. And yes, there's the tapping thing. Everybody else was truly blown away by Eruption, and I thought it was amazing. But for me, that was more for guitar players. I was just listening to the songwriting aspect of it and the way that he put together these songs. And these songs were like 3 minutes. It's not like they were, metal dirges. They were a very heavy band. They weren't metal, but they weren't like 6-minute songs with long solos. Typically, the solos were like 12 or 24 bars, maybe. But his sense of orchestration, it was a live performance. So whenever he'd drop out to do a solo, there was no rhythm guitar, which I thought was amazing.
Yeah.
A couple songs he did. He put rhythm parts underneath. So I absorbed all of that, and I thought, oh my God, that's that guy I met. Now I understand what people are talking about. So in a nutshell, that's sort of my early introduction about meeting this guy, Edward Van Halen.
Cool. So, Steve, around
Yeah.
about the same time, I've heard people saying that there was a bit of a buzz about Eddie, but also people were talking about Randy Rhoads. Had you heard about Randy Rhoads at the same time?
It's funny. I had actually seen, though I hadn't seen Van Halen perform, I had seen Quiet Riot perform. And Randy was then playing guitar with Quiet Riot. And I think I saw them certainly once, maybe twice. In all honesty, I was never a Quiet Riot fan. So maybe I tended not to take Randy as seriously as I would have had he been in a band that I kind of was more taken by.
Sure.
So I do remember seeing him. It was at the Starwood, which is the same club that Van Halen would be signed out of. Just a little club right off the Sunset Strip, and I'd been there many, many, many times. And I was there, and I saw Quiet Riot play. And I do remember Randy, and Randy was playing the Les Paul at the time, and I thought, he's good. He's a good guitar player, but there were a lot of good guitar players around him. George Lynch, maybe this is a little pre-George, but George Lynch was playing in his early bands, obviously pre-Dokken, and Warren DeMartini. There were some great guitar players. So I tended to dismiss Randy a little bit. When he finally got into Ozzy's band, I certainly listened to him more closely, and I recognized, wow, this guy really is an amazing guitar player. I never saw any comparison between Edward and Randy. Randy apparently confessed to being a fan of Edwards, and listened to him a lot. I don't know, but that was about as aware as I was of Randy, to be honest.
Okay. So after that initial meeting and then the album came out, how did you reconnect with Ed? Did you still have the phone number and call him up out of the blue?
Man, I kept that phone number. I wish I had called him. I didn't have the balls to do it, especially after the first record comes out, and I'm thinking, I'm going to call this guy. He's not going to remember me at all. I mean, I'm going to, I'll make an idiot of myself. Regrets. We shouldn't have regrets in life, man. That is one of them. But no, I never did call him back. So, I never called him. I'm sorry. So the record comes out. Van Halen one comes out in February of '78. Van Halen go on the road for their first world tour, opening for Montrose, who was second on the bill, which is where Sammy and Edward would actually first meet. I don't know if they were hanging out, if they became friends then, but playing all those gigs together, certainly their paths crossed. And Journey. Fast forward about a year, excuse me, after I meet Edward at the Whiskey, Van Halen was getting a little tired of being treated like second-class citizens on the Journey tour. They weren't allowed a sound check. Edward wasn't allowed to use some of his effects. They couldn't use their whole lighting rig. They were offered a spot on Bill Graham's Day on the Green. Day on the Green was this annual concert that Bill put on in the Oakland Coliseum, Northern California, where he brought together all these disparate bands for one day. Van Halen were invited to play the Day on the Green, which also featured AC/DC opening. This was AC/DC's first tour. Nobody knew who AC/DC was. And it just happened that Edward was a monster AC/DC fan. So AC/DC, Pat Travers, Aerosmith, and Foreigner. I was given an assignment from Guitar Player magazine to go to the show from LA to interview Mick Jones for Guitar Player. Well, I knew that Van Halen were playing, and I thought, oh my gosh, maybe I'll run into Edward again.
Mm-hmm.
I hadn't met him, I hadn't spoken to him, hadn't seen him since that previous July. So it's been about a year. So I fly up there, and my friend Neil Zlozower is there. Neil was a rock photographer. Neil and I would work many, many times over the years. Neil would become Van Halen's official photographer.
Yep.
So he's there shooting Van Halen. So he sees me there. We say hello. Excuse me. He says, "Hey man, you want to go backstage and say hello to Edward?" I go, "Yeah." Neil didn't know that I had met Edward about a year ago previously at the Whiskey. So Neil thought he was introducing me for the first time to Edward.
Sure.
And rather than get into the whole thing, "Hey Neil, I met him, he's going to remember me," I just thought,
just go with it.
I let him think he's introducing me. So I go back, and the way that it was set up is that there was one sort of general backstage area where all the bands could kind of hang out, and they had some catering and stuff. But then each band had like his own separate little area, his trailer, their trailers, their tour bus, that kind of thing. So I go back into the Van Halen compound, and there's Edward. And I'm walking up with Neil, and I'm thinking he's going to, see Neil, because he knows Neil. Neil had been shooting some of the shows. So I'm thinking, he's going to see Neil and see me, go, "Hey, man, good to see you." And maybe he wouldn't recognize me, but he'd didn't remember my name, but he recognized me, And I kind of go up, and to this day, I don't know if he remembered meeting me. And this would happen over and over. Not that he would forget meeting me, but certain events would happen. And I'm fast forwarding here, and I write all about this in my book, Tonechaser. On separate occasions, I would introduce Edward to Ritchie Blackmore. I would introduce him to Billy Gibbons and Les Paul. We would talk. I would see him the next day, and he never remembered at all that I had introduced him to any of these people.
Oh, wow.
It was really odd. And it wasn't that he was purposely being forgetful. He just didn't remember. And I can only, because it happened a lot, I can only chalk it up to the fact that his head was so filled with music, he just didn't remember things like that. So it was odd. So anyway, Neil introduces me. Hey, Ed, this is Steve Rosen. And we shake hands, and I'm thinking, he doesn't remember me. But it was fine. There's a great picture that was on the cover of the first edition of my book that Neil took backstage there. So that's the first time I run into him again.
Yep.
Fast forward, this is July, August, September, October, November, about another 4 or 5 months. It's December 78, and this is just the whole experience is surreal to this day. I must have given him my number, or maybe the label had set it up. I can't remember. To make a long story short, he comes over to my pad in Laurel Canyon. I rented a little guest house in Laurel Canyon, and he comes over to my place. I offered to drive to his place. He goes, no, man, I'll drive over to your place. So it's an afternoon, and Edward Van Halen is knocking on my front door. And he says, hey, man, come down to the car with me. We go down to this old beater car that he had. And he was so proud of it because I think he had taken some of his money that he'd earned from the road.
Yep.
He bought this piece of garbage. I don't know what it was, a Rambler or it was a horrible car that he paid $700 for, and he was so proud of it. And we get in the car, and he rolls up the windows, and it's a pretty warm day. And he's got this huge boom box sitting on the seat between us. And he puts in a cassette. He goes, hey, man, this is the record we're working on right now, you know. Cool. And he plays me all of the unmixed tracks from what was going to be Van Halen 2. And I'm sitting there listening to it, and I had no idea what he was going to do. I didn't have a pen. I couldn't take notes. So I'm listening to this stuff. There are no vocals. It was unmixed. I don't even remember if there was bass on it. I'm pretty positive there were drums. I know there was guitars, but that could have been it. Yep. So I'm sitting there listening to this, and I'm trying to remember each song that goes by. Fast shuffle, amazing solo, halftime, And as soon as one song goes by, your mind forgets the song that comes before it, And he's smoking. Excuse me. Edward always smoked. He was always smoking. Yep. It was a curse, and it ultimately killed him. And it was a horrible, horrible addiction. But the windows are up, and he's smoking, and the cab of the car is filling up with cigarette smoke. I was susceptible to migraine headaches. And cigarette smoke is like one of the worst things that it's like a major trigger for migraine sufferers. Sure. And I'm sitting there thinking, please, God, don't let me get a headache. Please, God, And the music is so loud, but all I can think of is, this is the greatest moment of my life. I mean, I realized how important it was for him to come over, play me these tracks, unreleased. We didn't know each other that well. For him to trust me, you know what I mean? I intuitively understood all of that.
Yep.
Tape gets done. We go back upstairs. I had a couple guitars in stands. The first thing he does is he walks over. I had a Strat. He starts taking the guitar apart. He goes, "Oh man, I can't play with the guitar now." But he asked me, "Oh, is it okay?" And I said, "You can do anything you want to, man. I don't care." He could have crashed like, Pete Townsend kindling for all I cared. And that was like the first interview. We sat down. I asked him about the first record and the tour. And it was just a remarkable, remarkable day, And that was just the first of many, many, many extraordinary conversations I'd had with him over the years. And many of the conversations were for magazines. I was writing for Guitar World. I began writing for Guitar World in '84. I wrote 3 covers on Edward, 84, 85, and 86, which were they were considered pretty important stories, and to this day people still remark on those stories, and they were really good stories, Plus I
Nice.
did a bunch of other big features on him. So a lot of interviews I did were for magazines, but a lot of times we just had conversations, and I would record the conversations, and a lot of these were just more personal. He'd talk about family, or problems with the band. I need to back up for one more minute here to give you a little more
Yep.
effort. So, 1986, I've known Edward at that point for about 9 years. By 86, the 1984 record had come out. Sammy had joined the band. He was arguably the most important guitar player on the planet. They were the biggest, if not one of the biggest bands in the world. They were selling millions and millions of records, selling out every concert ticket. Being the journalist I was, I'm thinking, writers are going to approach Edward Van Halen, and they're going to ask him to write his life story.
Sure.
So I thought, I've got to ask him. I never called him on his telephone number, and there were other things that I didn't do, and I thought, there's no way I'm going to have this regret in my life.
Yep.
So honestly, man, it took me weeks and weeks to build up the courage.
Yep.
It really did. I'd written books previously, some pretty cool books. I wrote a book on Jeff Beck that came out in Japan in '78. I wrote. Did I write any of the books that came out previous to then? No, I think it's just the one book. But I realized writing a book on Edward Van Halen was something special. This was something different. So I remember driving over there one day, and I write about it again in Tonechaser. And I remember walking in and thinking, I have to ask him first thing when I see him, because if I don't, the day will go by, I won't ask him. Go, Edward, I have to ask you something. Yeah, man, what? Go, listen, writers are going to approach you. They're going to want to write your life story, and I'd like to be the person to do that.
Great.
And I'm thinking, well, he'll take some time to think about it. He had been interviewed by other writers. I wasn't the only writer interviewing him. My interviews were special because no other writer had that relationship I did. No other writer went up to 5150 and hung out with him, and then the next day came back and hung out with him. There were a lot of very good writers. I'm not saying there weren't, but they didn't have that access, that entree that I did.
Yep.
And I was hoping he would realize that and appreciate that, But anyway, I thought, well, maybe he wants to think about it, And 2 things kept going through my head. I thought, well, if he says no, how disappointing that would be. And if he says yes, how utterly terrifying that will be. Now what do I do?
Yeah, sure.
Right?
Yep.
I've opened the lion's den's door. I've walked through, and now I'm inside the cage. Now what are you going to do, pal? So again, I figure he says he's going to say, give me some time, And literally 20 seconds later, he goes, yeah, of course. I couldn't think of anybody else but you. And for him to say that, it was just so much respect in that. And that's what I always felt from him. And I tried to write about it in the book. There was on the other side of that, there was nothing more important to Edward than respect. Look, I could say, Ed, that was not a very good solo you did. You could have done a better solo. And he'd go, yeah. And he might have been a little perturbed. But if it came from a place where it was just someone was trying to be insulting or belittling, or as another guitar player coming at him, saying that, it would piss him off. But if somebody came to him and said, man, you could have done a better solo, and it came from a place of respect, he would totally take it in stride and appreciate it. So it was always about respect for him, and he always showed me such respect,
Yeah.
And he could have just said little things that would have just shriveled me.
Yep.
On any given day, hey man, don't don't talk to me like that, or that was a lousy article you wrote, or there were times when I actually would sit and play guitar with him,
Yep.
not me sitting down, but he would say, "Hey, let's jam." It's like,
Sure.
can you
Yep.
imagine jamming with
Yep.
Edward Van Halen?
Yep.
You know, and I mean, I could barely move my fingers, and all he had to say was, "God, come on, man, play something. Don't be." You know what I mean? He never said that. He was encouraging. So for him to give me that response, so yeah, so that was. I'm trying to remember why I backtracked to give you that. I know why. So from '86 on, he said, "Yeah, man, record anything you want."
Great.
So it wasn't only the actual formalized interviews. It was us sitting down, and maybe he'd come over on a day, and he'd pop over. He'd come over because he wanted to hang out. I'm sorry, Rick.
You're right. You're right.
Excuse me. He'd come over because he wanted to hang out. Who knew? He'd knock on the door, he'd come in, smoke a cigarette, he asked me if I had any potato chips,
Yeah.
So he said, "Man, record anything you want, anytime, anywhere, I don't care." So a lot of these conversations that I recorded with him were more personal. They were, not specifically music oriented.
Yep.
Which is why those conversations, in many respects, I thought were even more revealing than sort of the musical interviews I did with him. And those were amazing. But these conversations were incredible. He talks about his dad, and the relationship with his mother, which wasn't terrific. I mean, it was amazing. A lot of times he would call me at 3 a.m, and he'd want to talk. And I ended up calling those the Twilight tapes because when they typically occurred.
Yep.
And he'd talk, and if I wasn't too tired, if I could get it together, I'd click on record, and I'd record these conversations. Years later, so 2003, our relationship ends, and I don't want to give the book away, but it was a sad ending. It wasn't terrific. So fast forward 17 years, 2020, 17 years pass. And off and on, I'd been thinking about the book in 1986. I'm sorry, let me backtrack again.
Yep.
So in 1986, he says, yes, we signed simple contracts, and there's photos of these contracts in the book. They're literally a couple of paragraphs. Yes, I, Edward Van Halen, give Steve Rosen permission to write my authorized biography, blah, blah, blah. So I start working on that biography, interviewing people, the band, his friends, promoters who were promoting shows when they were still back in Pasadena doing backyard parties, gathering these interviews. Well, that book never happened. Okay. Fast forward 17 years after the last time Edward and I speak in 2003, and I sit down to write the book, and it took me a long time to find that spot in my brain and my heart to be able to sit down and write the book. So much time had passed, I thought, my gosh, how am I going to remember all these things that happened? I had all the interviews, and certainly without the interviews, I mean, it would have been impossible. But I had all those conversations. It was probably about 30 or 40 hours, 50 hours of interviews I had done. But they were more like signposts. So they were, I can remember. So, that was the interview from the Fair Warning record, or
Yep.
That was the interview about the US Festival, the huge festival they did.
Mm-hmm.
It wasn't like on the tape was me talking about, I went over to Edward's house today, and he smoked more cigarettes and played his bumblebee guitar. It wasn't that kind of thing. It was just these interviews that acted as fodder for the narration. But what I did have were all of these other interviews, the Twilight tapes, which I'd sort of forgotten about. They were in this other binder. So I had everything on cassette. And here was this one black binder. This is a true story. All these tapes were by themselves. Some of them were labeled, some of them weren't. One had REL on it. And I put it on, and the first thing I hear is Edward talking about his dad. His dad, who was his biggest influence, his dad was a musician, a jazz musician. And Edward is talking about his dad calling him, Edward, a genius. And Edward is talking about that. And I can hear Edward crying. And I go, oh, that's the tape. I go, there it is. I've got these tapes. These are the key pieces. These will be the main figures. And from these, I hope I can recall enough. So slowly over the course, it took me 14 months to write the book. I'd previously written, by this time I'd written 7 books. I'd written a book on Randy Rhoads. I'd never interviewed Randy. I was approached to write the book. Wrote a book on Free and Bad Company. I wrote a book on Sabbath, the Jeff Beck book, a book on Bruce Springsteen, book on Prince. Those books, I think the one that took me the longest took about 4 months. But this took 14 months. And the reason I guess I'd waited so long after speaking with Edward for the final time in 2003 was, one, again, I was afraid that my memories would be so dim that it would be fruitless. And 2, I looked on the book, I thought, still by 2020, he was still considered probably one of the greatest guitar players in the world. Mm-hmm. And so I thought, if I write this book, and this is just me thinking, I don't know how other writers thought, but I thought, if I write this book, it has to be on a level sort of as a literary work. It has to be on a level with what Edward is as a musician.
Sure.
I thought it has to be like one long, 450-page brilliant guitar solo, and every word had to be perfect. And I mean, I set this task for myself, and it was hard, man. I mean, I edited and I re-edited and I write and I'd go back and I'd trash that whole section. And I thought, I'm never going to get through this.
Yep.
And slowly, piece by piece, I get through a chapter and I go back and I read some and I tear it apart. And as I'm tearing it apart, I'm thinking to myself, that's the worst. Those are the worst questions. Why would you ask him those questions? I'm thinking, as I'm looking at the interviews, I'm musing to myself, why would you ask him those questions? Why would you make those comments to him? I'm now listening to the tapes, and this is real. This is me saying stuff to him. And somehow I thought, you know what? I think other people need to bore into my brain to know what I'm thinking as I'm doing these interviews.
Sure.
So I created this section in the book that I call Notes. And there's different titles. Some is called Quarter Notes, Half Notes, Full Notes, Dead Notes. I mean, I'm trying to be clever with it, And what this is that this person in this section called Notes, this is this omniscient dude who's way smarter than this Steve Rosen guy who's sitting there in the room. This guy in the notes section, he knows everything. So he's looking at Rosen and he's going, Rosen, you moron. How could you say those things to Edward Van Halen? Aren't you embarrassed? And so I would comment on myself as I'm writing it about being with Edward. I mean, it becomes like a inside and outside thing, It was something I'd never read before. It was sort of me commenting on my own performance as a journalist, as a friend.
Sure.
What kind of a friend would say those things? Rosen, don't, and people love those sections. It was incredibly honest. Yep. And at first I thought, this is the stupidest thing I've ever heard of. No one's going to get it. And people loved that because it was so transparent and so open. And how vulnerable I always felt being around him. Look, I was around him a lot, but never for one, minute did I forget that this person who was sitting across from me, drinking a beer, eating my bag of potato chips, was Edward Van Halen, this guitar player. I mean,
sure.
Look, I'd met many, many, many famous people, but I'd never, I was never really able to call them friends or spend this quality time. Okay. So the book, in my mind, was really, it was a different approach to a biography, and I wanted the book to read like fiction. I wanted it to read really easy. I didn't want it to be, fraught with dates and guitar stuff. There were other books out there that did that much better than my book. My book included that, but that's not what my book was. My book was understanding Edward. Who
Yep.
was this guy? And what was he like when he wasn't on stage? And was he nervous about things? Did he have frailties? And was he uncertain about certain things? So that's the kind of book I wanted to write.
Okay. So, Steve, to jump back a bit, when you were saying about sitting in the car and getting a bit of a preview on Van Halen 2 while they were recording it, was he fishing for feedback on it from you? Because I do find that the better the artist, the more open they are to feedback. Guys who are sort of entry level, you try and offer your piece, and they just look at you like, no, but this is how it goes. So how was Edward in that regard?
He honestly never said one word until we got into the car. I think he said, yeah, this is the record we're working on. He never said, hey, man, let me know what you think. But yes, I think he wanted to know what I thought. And I learned early on that what Edward did not need to hear was, or did more specifically did not want to hear, was, my God, Ed, that's the most amazing sounding record I've ever heard. You're playing, oh my God, it was incredible. How did you... He didn't want to hear that. He was almost insulted by it.
Yep.
Edward Van Halen knew he was a very good guitar player. He just had that sense about him. And you didn't have to tell him that. You didn't have to say that to him. And when you did, he was sort of not insulted, but it was like, okay, but what is it that you like about it, and this and that, So yes, I think he did want to hear my feedback. I tried not to be too effusive, and I tried to remember the moments that I could to continue this story. So after we finished listening to the cassette in his car, we go up into my little guest house in the Hollywood Hills. He picks out one of my guitars, pulls the volume knob off, and he goes, yeah, man, so this is that first song you heard. And he starts playing, I forget, I can't remember the chronology, Dance the Night Away. So he starts playing on my electric guitar acoustically. And I have a little amp there, and he didn't even plug in the guitar. I thought this is so amazing. And he's playing these parts, and I'm going, oh my God. Listening to the tape was one thing. Watching him play these parts on my guitar in front of me 2 feet away and watching him pick and his left hand, it's like, it was sublime artistry. I mean, it was amazing, So I'm watching and, he'd do something, or some of those chimes in Dance the Night Away. I go, oh my God, is that how you do that stuff? I'd be remarking back. And that stuff he loved. He loved being the teacher, or, yeah, man, this is what I did. Isn't this cool, But yes, I think that he was looking for my feedback on it. And I tried to balance that between just going crazy and making remarks that I thought were pretty astute and, that came from a more musical place, At a point in time, there was some quick little pattern that he did in one of the songs when he switches the guitar pick from, normal thumb and first finger to thumb and middle finger, to do what he called the flutter picking. And I saw him do that, and I go, my God, how do you do that? He goes, I don't know, man. It's like a nervous spasm. But, and he would come over, I think, again and play me tracks before a record came out, and then come up into the pad, Van Halen 3, I think, and then play the songs acoustically on one of my guitars and show me what he was doing. And those were amazing moments. Those were incredible.
Wow.
Yeah.
Did he often talk about other guitar players that he admired? You said he was into AC/DC. Was he very aware of what other guitar players were out there were doing, and was he concerned with what they thought about him?
Yeah, man, good question. So I actually wish I dived into this more with him. He would always bring up sort of the same guitar players. He was a huge Alan Holdsworth fan.
Yeah, I've heard this. Yep.
Loved Alan Holdsworth from UK. I mean, the band UK, not from the UK. He loved Alan's playing, and then of course, famously, he was going to produce Alan's record for Warner's, but he had to go on the road. Alan went ahead and did the record with Ted Templeman without Edward, which was a huge, huge mistake. But that's another story. Clapton was his favorite. He talked a lot about Clapton, and remember he would come over to the pad, and we'd talk about Cream, and I think I might have asked him, did you ever learn the Crossroads solo? And he played the Crossroads solo, because, man, I haven't played it for a while. I mean, he played it flawlessly, and he had the vibrato down. So I was a huge Clapton fan. I asked him about Jeff Beck, and he said not so much, which I thought was a little strange. I thought he would have been a bigger Beck fan. Yep. He liked the Blow by Blow record. And I said, well, what about, sort of Truth and Beckola, those early records? He goes, no, I never really listened to those, which I thought was really strange. He was a Cactus fan, like Jim McCarty, but really only talked about him in passing. He was a big Billy Gibbons fan.
Oh, yeah.
Big ZZ Top fan. We really didn't talk about it too much. I don't think it really concerned him too much what other guitar players thought about him. I know that he never particularly liked that other guitar players were copying him. Yep. He always thought that a guitar player should go out and get his own style,
Sure. Yep.
So I don't think that came off as any kind of a compliment to him. I think he just looked on it as laziness.
Yep.
I do remember, sort of on a peripheral note of what you're talking about, Rick, I had a huge record collection. So even before I started writing, and as I mentioned, labels were sending me all their monthly releases, I had a pretty big record collection. I used to go to used record stores, and I was buying used records. I loved to do that. So I probably had about 2,000 or 3,000 records.
Wow.
Before I ever started writing. Yeah. But by the time Edward was coming over to the pad, I had a really big collection by then.
Yep.
So I remember taking him back. I had all the records sort of in my bedroom. They were like on these very cheap shelves. You'd put bricks on a board and put the records on them and stack the boards, and hopefully they didn't tumble over and crush me under vinyl during the dead of night. So I remember thinking, well, I bet I have some records that Edward might dig listening to. And in my mind, maybe he'll listen to them, and just pick up some little thing from a guitar player, that maybe becomes something, part of his playing somewhere down the road. Wouldn't that be cool? So I remember taking him back there and giving him a fair amount of records. I remember it was a pretty big stack. I think I was giving him like Steely Dan records. Look, and I knew he knew who Steely Dan was. I'm not saying he was ignorant of Steely Dan, but maybe some of the earlier records, maybe he only knew the hits. Steely Dan had all these amazing guitar players, all these studio guys playing on their records. I thought maybe he might dig listening to some of that. I remember giving him some Larry Carlton solo records. Larry was certainly coming from a different place. Larry was more of a jazz guy, but Larry was a remarkable player. I thought Edward, maybe you might hear something interesting in Larry's playing. I remember giving him some Les Paul records. And at the time, he was kind of unaware who Les Paul was.
Oh, really?
He knew about Les Paul guitars,
Yep.
yeah.
Yeah.
Later, when, and I'm jumping subjects here, in 1984, for 1985, Van Halen, Edward was inducted into the Rock Walk Hall of Fame, the Guitar Center Rock Walk Hall of Fame, where musicians put their handprints
Yep.
in the cement.
Yep.
Les Paul was also inducted that night. I had interviewed Les earlier, and I thought, how amazing would it be if I could get these two guys together? So I approached Les Paul. I go, Les, Edward Van Halen's here. Would you want to sit down and talk with him? And he said, yes, if Edward wants to do that. I went to Edward. I go, Edward, Les Paul is here. Would you like to sit down and talk with him? And he said, yes, if Les wants to. So anyway, I got them both in a room, and that became actually a story for Guitar World magazine. But I also write about it in the book Tonechaser. But at the time, when Edward was over, I don't think he was that aware of Les Paul as inventor and guitar player, that kind of thing. So I gave him some Les Paul records. I knew that he was, Edward was into Clapton, so I thought, well, maybe he'd appreciate some other blues players, and stuff he may have heard of. I don't know. So I gave him some. I remember giving him some Michael Bloomfield records and Rory Gallagher. I knew he was into UK, the prog band, so I gave him some other, prog stuff, Soft Machine, Colosseum, these English prog bands. Maybe some early Supertramp,
Yep.
just thinking, maybe he'll listen to some of the stuff, So, kind of weeks go by, and I know he's busy, and I thought he'd say something about, hey, man, listen to his records and, cut like that or didn't like that, And I never heard a word. He never said one word, And that was it. I felt kind of funny saying, hey, man, did you listen to any records or, anything like that? So I never said anything.
Yeah.
So nothing was ever said. I don't think he ever listened to one record.
Oh, really?
And he never gave me my records back. So I want my records back. So, I'm kidding.
So Steve, you mentioned his love for Clapton, but I've also heard that along the way, he had a bit of a falling out with Clapton, or he was a bit disappointed in him. Do you know much about that?
Man, I can't imagine what that must have felt like. So Edward does the Starfleet project with Brian May.
Yep.
Right. So Brian is in L.A. and I guess they were doing. I guess it was music for a kids show.
Yep.
I think it was a UK kids show, right?
Yep.
Called Starfleet, or I'm not exactly sure actually. So he called on Edward, who he knew, and Edward went down, and they spent an afternoon jamming. And Brian was a Clapton fan, and they did a song called Blues Breaker, as an homage to Eric. And I'm getting all this secondhand. I mean, I've never interviewed Eric Clapton, so I do not know. But
Sure.
Apparently Eric heard it and was insulted by it. Hey, this has nothing to do with me or whatever he said. Edward doesn't play the blues. And that must have been crushing for Edward to hear that. I mean, look, Eric Clapton can feel the way he wants about anybody, right? That's his prerogative. But he must have known that his comments would reverberate around the world because they were being made about arguably the biggest guitar player on the planet, So did he have to make those comments? I don't know. I don't know. I can give you. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
I was going to say, it sounds like he may have even been looking to stir a bit of controversy just to become, reintroduce himself into the public eye. Just say, hey, don't forget about me. I'll say these statements, and could have been a bit of that about it.
That's a very astute comment to make. I absolutely agree. Because by then, yes, look, Eric Clapton has had a career that arguably continues to this day. But yeah, I mean, again, side by side, did more people know about Edward Van Halen than Eric Clapton at that point? Probably yes. So I agree with that. Later, they're great buddies, right? You see pictures of them later on, hands around each other. It's all forgotten. We're great friends.
Okay.
That bothers me, right? That bothers me so badly, I can't even tell you. And I'll tell you why. I interviewed Jimmy Page twice. Second time was in 1986 when he was with the Firm. I flew to Florida to interview him for a Guitar World cover. So I finally sit down with him to do the interview, and Jimmy Page is not an easy person to speak with.
Sure.
I interviewed him in '77 with Zeppelin, and he is not an easy person to speak with. He's just not. So we sit down, and from the first question, he gave me grief. He made life miserable. It was terrible. I ended up actually getting a migraine headache while I was speaking with him.
Oh, wow.
I honestly thought I was going to end up vomiting on his shoes. And somehow I made it back to my hotel room and threw up in the bathroom. Hate to be graphic, man, but that's what migraines would cause.
Yep.
So at a point in time, it's like he was antagonizing me so much, I thought, well, I'm going to take a shot. So I said, well, what do you think about Edward Van Halen? So again, this is 1986. Van Halen is huge. Jimmy Page, look, he's still Jimmy Page. He's a hero. He's a legend. What he did would never be forgotten. But let's face it, he's in the Firm. The Firm was not Led Zeppelin, you know, in my mind, artistically or ticket sales wise. Anyway, so I said, what do you think about Van Halen? He goes, well, I can appreciate, his technique. And I said, well, Edward does that tapping thing and nobody else does that. He goes, well, yeah, like I said, in the UK, I wasn't that aware of him because they weren't on MTV, So I asked him about 4 or 5 other questions just to piss him off.
Yep.
So I said, well, I'm good friends with Edward. He goes, yes, I know you are. And I asked him a couple more questions, and he finally said, well, I don't have a smile like Edward does. But not once did he ever really say anything positive about him. I don't think he cared for Edward's playing, which is fair enough. Hey, he doesn't have to.
Yep.
But I was gonna keep jabbing him with the sharp stick. And then when I said, hey man, I'm friends with him. He goes, yeah, I know you are. It's like, okay, I've had my piece. Now I can go vomit in my room peacefully. You know what I mean? So again, fast forward, Edward passes away. Who comes out? Oh, Jimmy Page, all the guitar players making their comments. Oh, Jimmy Page. Oh, Edward was a great guitar player and we were best friends. No, you weren't. History gets written by the person who happens to be there with a pencil at the moment. Has nothing to do with fact. And that's what pissed me off about Clapton. Oh, now we're good buddies. And again, with Jimmy, they were, friends. Did Edward ever forget about Clapton making those comments? No, I'm sure he didn't. Did Edward know about the comments Jimmy made about me and my story? Maybe not. Did I mention them to him? Maybe not. But I just find it so disingenuous, that all of a sudden, oh, we're great buddies and Edward was the greatest, and that's not the truth. So,
Sure.
Yeah.
So, Steve, a lot has been said about Ed in his early days being quite shy and turning his back on the crowd when he was doing the tapping, etc. And I've heard it said that started him drinking, was to get over his insecurities. Did you see any of that? Was he insecure about his playing in any way? What are your thoughts on that?
I never spoke to him, and I wish I had, because I'm sure he would have talked about it, about his drinking. Ed, why do you drink so much? What is it that you get from drinking? I wish I had those conversations with him. I suppose that there was a line that I thought I couldn't cross.
Sure.
That belonged more to the family. But I don't think he drank because of being shy. The stories I heard about him turning around was that Dave said, hey man, when you do the tapping thing, you need to turn around so nobody can copy what you're doing.
Sure.
Which I thought was, funny, if it was true. Look, you could have watched Edward doing what he was doing. Everybody ultimately learned what it was, and no one ever quite got it like him, and it was always Edward's. Look, I think Edward was drinking, and Alex talks about his dad gave them a beer when they were 6 years old. I mean, that was just a European thing.
Yeah.
Obviously, not to have his kids drink when they were young, but that was just a European thing.
Yep.
And his dad did drink, and his dad did smoke. So I think just being around that, it just became natural. By 13, Edward was smoking.
Yeah.
Was he drinking regularly by 13? Maybe close. I think later on, I think it became, look, I'm hypothesizing here. I don't know. It's true. With fame comes pressure. I can tell you the first 2 years that I knew Edward, those first 2 tours, the first 2 albums, he was the happiest. I saw it. He was like, he had gone from playing these backyard parties in Pasadena to playing in front of 200 people at the Whiskey A Go-Go, to opening tours, to headlining tours, to making albums. It was all new. And he was drinking, and he did drugs in those early days, but I don't think it was anything like what it turned into.
Yeah.
And I just think as time went by, and could be unspoken pressure, but the pressure is still there. Label wants a big record. You've got to perform on tour. I think maybe it became an excuse to drink. I don't know that he thought, even though he used to say to me, "Yeah, man, I get on stage," and when he would get sober for short periods of time, and he goes, "Yeah, man, it's the first time I've been sober on a tour." Did he drink because he was so nervous? I don't know. It was an excuse. Was the excuse to drink, or was drinking the excuse? I mean, I don't know. I don't know.
Sure.
I guess the question is, and I think I did ask him. I'm sorry. I think I did ask him about the studio.
Yeah.
Man, would you get drunk, or man, would you get drunk when you go into recording? He goes, "No, we always waited till after the session." So I think he was aware of that, right? But yeah, I don't know, man. It was just it was just a terrible addiction with him, He was ultimately able to give up drugs and drinking, and could never fully quit smoking. Towards the end there, he was vaping, which is arguably worse than smoking, but that was the one addiction he couldn't give up. And I write about it in the book. I said, smoking is going to kill him. It won't be the drugs or the alcohol, which did him no good. They didn't make him healthy, and maybe made him more susceptible to, the diseases that he got later on, but they didn't specifically kill him. Cigarettes did. So
yeah.
It's horrible.
Yeah. I know people who have given up some very hard drugs who cannot give up nicotine. So I feel his pain. Now your book's called Tonechaser. Did he talk much to you about chasing tones? And
honestly, man, that's a great question. He never specifically talked to me about chasing tones. So I'm writing the book, and I'm writing, and I'm in several chapters, and along the way I'm thinking, you need a title, man, and I had no title. I remember kicking around a couple. I remember one was something like a time was this. Like, this was a time, like a poetic twisting of words. And I read it back. I go, people aren't going to get that. That means, that could be about anybody,
Sure. Yeah.
And then I had one, blood, frets, and beers. I thought, no, man, that sounds like a country hoedown, barbecue. So I kept writing. One of the last interviews, literally, I think it was maybe the last interview I ever did with him, was a phoner. And we're talking, and I don't know how it came up, but, and again, I write about this in the book pretty extensively because it was pretty important. And he goes, yeah, man, I'm sorry. I'm going to just get my book here because the quote is on sort of the first page here because it's so important. And he says to me, apropos of nothing, out of the blue, I don't know what we were talking about. He says, I'm a tone chaser, and I'm always chasing tone. It's that elusive thing you hear in your head that you just can't quite get. And as soon as I heard that on the tape, I go, oh my God, that's the title,
Absolutely.
Tone Chaser.
Yep.
And what was so remarkable about that is that Edward never spoke like that. He never, that was a very sort of an erudite designation, in describing himself. He would have said, no, man, I just got a bunch of new pedals and some more outboard gear, man, and I tweaked the microphone and this and that. Now that is tone chasing, but he never identified it as such. So for him to identify himself as a tone chaser, recognizing what that was, and to use the word elusive, and that he's never caught it. Had he said, yeah, I got it, then it would have been like, oh, okay, so you have reached the end. It's never going to get any bigger or better or different for you. The fact that he recognized, no, I'll never get it, or I'm not there yet. So, for him to recognize himself as a tone chaser, I thought that was remarkable. No, we never really spoke about that process. I tried to talk to him, I think, a little bit about it. In fact, I've had this conversation with other writers, and I've always wondered, other guitar players, does the guitar player, did Brian May have this sound in his head and built that guitar with his dad, the Red Special, whatever that's called,
Yep.
Did David Gilmour have that sound in his head and realize, well, only a Stratocaster was going to give it to me? Or did he know the sound of a Stratocaster, and did his songwriting and his guitar tone get shaped around it? Edward, who was an inventor, of course, and if he had never played a single note in his lifetime, and just had built sort of the one, pickup humbucker Strat, would have been enough. When he built those guitars, did he hear the song in his head? Was he tone chasing at that point? Was he building this gear to capture that tone? Was the guitar built and he plugged it in and he goes, oh, there's the sound? And so I've always wondered about what came first, the chicken or the egg. Yeah. But no, I never specifically talked to Edward about the tone chasing thing. Okay. Look, he was forever bringing in new gear. And at the end of the day, 5150, the studio, had every imaginable piece of outboard gear. And he had a very expensive custom-made SSL board. So, I mean, he had every toy in the world. And some people will tell you that, his greatest guitar sounds were on those first 2 or 3 records, running through his amp and his Variac and that stuff, And later when he started getting, experimenting around with different amps and heads and guitars and stuff, that, the sound wasn't quite the same. But, that's all opinion. So
sure. Now, you described him as being an inventor just before, and that was something I'd written down here, was to ask you about. Did he share with you any of the little inventions, like his drop tuner? And I only just realized recently I saw something about a different kind of bridge that he had that would drop the low E down to a B and stuff like that. Were you privy to any of the things that he was working on in the background?
Yeah, no, not really. Whenever somebody asks me a question like that, I get frustrated because I think, why didn't you ask him about those things?
Sure. Yeah.
It's like you're in the moment, so you're hanging out with somebody and you think that those days are never going to end, that you're going to have all this time, to sit down and have those conversations and ask him about all of those early family things and, the various inventions and about each guitar and, dig deeper into these questions you had. You think you'll have all the time in the world. But in answer to your question, Rick, no, I think the only thing he ever mentioned was he described to me that he had built that he described it as those trays that like bellboys used to use
Yeah.
to carry food. That's the one that popped up, and so he could access and play his, the neck of the guitar like a piano, so his fingers were, splayed out like they would be on a piano keyboard. But I think that was about the only one, and then realizing much later that he had many, many, many patents. We did talk a little bit. He was working early on with an amp, an amp builder named Jose Arredondo.
Yep.
And he worked on an amp with Jose for a while, and he talked a little bit about that. But that was about it. Yeah.
So how about those 3 a.m. phone calls that you said? Were they usually on tour? Was that he was so amped up and he couldn't wind down? He's like, oh, I need to talk to somebody. Or was that off the road?
That's a good question. I think they were both.
Yeah.
I can remember once he was on the road, and I honestly, it was like a 5-hour conversation, and I could shoot myself for not recording this.
Yeah.
I wish I could think of an excuse that's big enough for it, But literally, he talked for hours. I think he was on the road, and I don't think he was real happy. But I do know that many of the conversations were from home. And again, honestly, in many ways, he was more honest with me than I was with him.
Yep.
And I would talk about family things. I guess part of me always thought that I don't want to unload on the guy.
Yep.
Like he's got enough going on, and he's, this is Edward Van Halen. He's got all these other pressures. He never would have thought that way. And from time to time, I did. It got pretty personal. Got like, we're both kind of in tears. And I remember once, and in fact, I even left this part out of the book. It's on tape, and I left it out because it was just too personal for me to put in. But, it was kind of like during Christmas or something, and it was like, oh, I don't have a girlfriend, and, it's Christmas blues. And he was so amazing about it, He was just so supportive about it. And, hey, man, go pick up your guitar, go play guitar, it'll be okay, But, I honestly think that most of them came when he was home.
Yep.
And again, because he would have been up in the studio, I have no doubt, and it was 3 or 4 in the morning, and he would have been out there, since early evening, messing around with something, and he'd just pick up the phone and call. And it's funny, in the book I also write, towards the end, periods of time would go by when we wouldn't talk to each other.
Yep.
But he says, hey, man, I'll call you. And I go, okay. He goes, no, don't tell me, And he recited my phone number after years and years. He goes, see, man, I remember your phone number. I go, yeah, you do, So, yeah.
I'm laughing because there's a certain music store I go to on the coast here, and one of the guys there, as soon as I walk in, recites my phone number to him because I won't give away my phone number on air, but the last digits are 5150, and the rest of it all relates to guitar as well. And he just looks at me and he just goes, and he spits it out to me every time. He goes, I can't forget that phone number. I'm like, you beauty. So did you ever get to play his Frankenstein guitar?
I did.
And was it as much of a pig as what I've heard? I've heard it wasn't the nicest playing guitar. Yeah?
It was horrible. I mean, look, like I said, back in the day when I had my bands, I was kind of playing every day, and, I was on a scale, I was maybe a C guitar player. Maybe at moments I was C plus, maybe at moments I was a little better than average. I was okay. I understood more about guitar than I was capable of playing it. In other words, I could play different chords. I didn't know what they were. I could experiment with things. I was able to do that. I I never spent the time to become a really, really good guitar player. I mean, that's the honest truth. So in answer to your question, yeah, I remember being up at 5150, and this happened a couple times, and I write about this in the book. And he'd go, "Let's jam." Why? Because he's Edward Van Halen, and that's all he knows how to do.
Sure.
And it doesn't matter that it's me. It could have been me. It could have been Jimi Hendrix. It could have been Jack Bruce. He never thought like that. Oh, Steve, yeah. Well, I know he knew I played guitar, but he never thought, oh, it's only Steve. He doesn't really know how to play well. What are we going to do if I jam with him? I know that thought never crossed his mind, because if it did, he never would have asked the question. So he sat down and he hands me the Frankenstrat, and he picks up a bass. I remember it was a Spectre bass. And so I'm sitting there trying to think, oh my God, now you're not talking to this guy, you're playing guitar with him? What are you going to do? Dude, you've got to play something, come up with something, and I'm trying to control myself. I'm not trying to say to Ed, I don't think I can do it, because he wouldn't want to hear that. He'd just say, just play. So I remember coming up with this little riff that I'd been working on. I was writing original songs, blah, blah, blah. And I had this riff. It was a cool little riff. And immediately he jumps on it. And he's playing bass, and his bass playing kind of a cross between like a Jack Bruce and John Entwistle meets Tim Bogert, his favorite guitar players. But his guitar was horrible. My God, the action was not, it wasn't light. His vibrato bar, I don't know how many springs he had, and his vibrato bar didn't float, right? It only pushed down.
Yep.
Because he rested his palm there, and if it was a floating vibrato bar like Jeff Beck had, it would have put the guitar out of tune. But it was really tight. It was terrible.
Yeah.
And then he came over to the house once, and he had the Bumblebee guitar, and it was equally as bad.
Oh, wow. Have you seen the videos getting around of him jamming backstage on a Strat around the For Unlawful Carnal Knowledge album, and he's tripping out about the trem that he can pull it back? Have you seen those videos?
I haven't seen that.
No? Okay, so that's my friend's guitar. My friend was opening for Van Halen back then, and so he got to jam with him, and he said it was amazing. He would stick his head in the dressing room door and, yeah, let's jam. And that you'll find that on YouTube if you look around. And my friend always said, man, he could play through this crappiest little amp and he still sounded like him. And you said before, even when he would play unplugged,
exactly.
Yeah, he just had that sound, right?
Exactly. Well, what was the name? What's your friend's band's name?
The Baby Animals, they were called, or they still are called.
Oh,
yeah. So
that's not the band that backed. Oh no, I'm thinking of Baby Lemonade. They didn't back Arthur Lee, did they?
No.
No. Okay, I'm sorry. There was a band called Baby Animals. Arthur Lee was in a band called Love. It was a '60s band here. Anyway, I'm getting my bands mixed up. Anyway, well, there's a cool story. Edward used to come over, and I had a pig nose, and pig noses, were horrible.
Yeah.
I mean, they had that, like that was real bassy, and he played through that, and he sounded like it. Although he did admit, man, these things are kind of pretty bassy, but he still sounded amazing. But yeah, just playing acoustically on an electric. I mean, it was you could not mistake it for anybody but Edward Van Halen.
Sure.
Right?
Yeah. Well, that they all say it, toners in the fingers. And I've heard many stories of people saying that they got a chance to play through Ed's rig and were bitterly disappointed because it didn't have this magic sound that they thought, and it was just like, wow, it's in his hands. Yeah,
it was amazing when we jammed at one time. I was running through his rig. I don't know if he was his Marshalls were. I don't know what it was, but I sounded good because I had never had a guitar sound like that. But it was just so unique to him. Just amazing.
Now, Steve, at the start, you mentioned Neil Zlozower and him introducing you guys. That is a name that I had seen on all the photographs of all my idols when I was a teenager. It was always photography, Neil Zlozower. And I pictured this suit, essentially. This guy in a suit, being all prim and proper. And it was only a couple of years ago I saw a documentary on Zloz and just went, oh my God, what a dude. Look at this guy.
Exactly.
How did you first meet Neil Zlozower?
Yeah. So I don't think Neil has ever worn a suit in his life.
I doubt it too.
Right. And I was actually in that documentary they made about him. I'm actually in there. Neil was kind enough to have me come in and say a few nice words. So, so I began writing mid '72. December '73, my first guitar player story comes out, and it also happens to be a cover. That cover, that shot, is taken by Neil Zlozower. So I recognize the name. I hadn't met him yet. I think another year goes by, a year and a half. Exactly where and when we met, I cannot remember. It must have been, back in the day, labels through record parties for bands. It was probably at a party somewhere. Our paths crossed, and Neil Zlozower, yeah, they used your picture in my story, blah blah blah, and we just started hanging out. Neil, it turns out, just lived about 15 minutes from me. His studio was very close to me in Hollywood, and we started working together. I do the interview. Neil would shoot the pictures.
Yep.
And I said, Neil, man, all I ask is, just take a picture of me and whoever I'm interviewing, and that's all I ask for. And he would always do that, and send me a slide or make an 8x10 for me. And so we have literally known each other since certainly '75.
Wow.
So what is that? 50 years, 51 years.
Yep.
Did a lot of very cool interviews together, and he shot so many of my interviews. And I wrote the text for one of his books, Six String Heroes. I went through and provided sort of quotes from a lot of guitar players that he had shot. And a lot of those pictures that he shot were sessions from my interview. After he would, shoot the interview, he'd, take a guy aside and maybe in a hotel room and shoot more pictures. So that was pretty cool. We actually went to Europe together for a week, hung out for a week. He was great, always had my back. He kindly, generously gave me the 3 photos on the 3 editions of my book. He gave me those photos.
Nice.
I offered to pay him because I don't take money from friends. And he's always had my back, and I think he's probably the most remarkable rock photographer of all time. I think his Van Halen photos are the greatest. It's no wonder that Van Halen embraced him, because Neil was as crazy as those guys were. Maybe more so. Neil was a crazy dude. Neil loved fast cars. He loved old Porsches. He loved motorcycles. Neil, and I don't think he'd mind me telling you, Neil drank. My God, he could, he could hold his own with those guys. And, Neil was always down for getting crazy and insane. And he's just a real rock and roll guy,
Yeah.
In fact, he kindly invited me to his 70th anniversary, his 70th birthday. And that was fun. A bunch of rock and roll people were there. And the guy's amazing,
Nice.
The thing about Neil is, if Neil isn't yelling at you, then he doesn't like you. Then he's not your friend.
Is that right?
Yeah. So Neil, I get together with him. So when I'm writing the book, and I'm thinking, well, I bet you Neil knows some book agents, because he's come out with these wonderful photo books. I bet he knows some heavy agents. Maybe somebody would be interested in the book. So I go, Neil, man, do you know any agents? Can I cuss on this, Rick?
Yeah, absolutely. Fuck yeah.
Says, Rosen, don't be a fucking, and that's how he talks. Rosen, don't be a fucking idiot. Agent, they're going to take money. They're not going to get you a deal. Do the book yourself. Just put the book out, self-publish. You know, publisher won't give you any advance. Don't be a fucking moron. Are you an idiot? What's wrong with you? And he was right. So, but that's how we talk, you know. So it's when Neil stops yelling at me, which he hasn't done for 50 years, then I have to start worrying, you know.
Is that a hard of hearing thing as well? I mean, you guys, I know, geez, my hearing's a bit down from my younger days playing rock and roll music, but you guys would have been around it a lot. Do you think a lot of that has to do with his hearing?
No.
No?
No, Neil was like this when he was probably 10 years old. I'm
Really?
kidding.
Yeah.
I'm kidding. No, Neil has always been loud and brash.
Yep.
And that's just who he is. And he treats everybody the same way.
Yep.
So I don't know if you saw in the film those guys talking about Neil, those musicians. If you were a musician and you weren't giving him 100%, you'd get, come on, you fucking asshole, lift your chin up.
Yep.
Put your hair back. You look like an old man. Don't be give me some attitude. You know, you're a rock and roll guy. You know.
Yeah.
And that's just who he was. It didn't matter who you were. You know, which somehow makes it okay. You know, that he treats everybody like that, whether you're, you know, a rock and roll journalist or a famous guitar player.
Sure. And I think the fact that he partied with the bands as well, with camera in hand, would have been a great way for him to get that inside and the shots that other people didn't get. Did you ever get to party with the band? Because I've heard they were big time partiers. Did you ever get to indulge with them?
A little. I mean, I was not a party kind of person, which is to say, I didn't really drink because of the migraine thing. Alcohol was a terrible trigger, and I just really hated the taste of alcohol anyway. Yep. But in all honesty, yeah, Edward and I got, not that it was partying on a big scale, but we did drugs fairly regularly, and I got to tell you, man, it was a lot of fun. I wouldn't condone it for anybody. I'm not saying go out and take drugs. I'm not saying that at all. But back in the day, you know, I'm up at the studio or I'm at my house, you know, and you start doing some drugs, and it was fun. I mean, if it wasn't fun, I wouldn't have done it. But it was amazing fun. And Edward, he just became more Edward. He just became bigger than life, you know, and it wasn't like he was a sad drunk or he was just amazing. There might have been, moments, maybe some backstage stuff that that maybe I'd done a little bit with him, but honestly, not really. It just wasn't who I was, you know. Had the occasions arise, would I have done it? Probably. But, as it was, no, not really. But, I mean, Edward and I had our share of moments, you know.
Yep.
Pretty fun moments, to be sure.
So you mentioned that he brought up his relationship with his parents and, was crying at just getting praise from his father. But then he said the relationship was a little different with his mother. You care to elaborate on that? Is that something you can talk about?
You know, some of the comments he made about his mom were so personal that, even as I was, transcribing, and I'm asking myself, do I really want to put this in there? The last thing on my mind when I was writing this book was I never wanted to embarrass or demean or insult anybody from the Van Halen family. That was the last thing on my mind. In fact, what I was always hoping was that I was going to hear from someone in the Van Halen family at some point, which I haven't. I've not spoken to anyone besides Edward in 2003 Well, since 2003, not one word. Part of me was thinking before I started writing the book was to reach out to them and to tell them uh, that I was going to write this book. So when I began the book in, August 2020, Edward was still alive. 6 weeks after I begin the book, he passes away in October, and I forget the exact date. October 2020. So I really wanted to try to reach out to Edward to let him know I was going to write the book before I started it. But I hadn't spoken to him for so many years. I thought I couldn't bring myself to do it. I wanted to reach out to the family, but I didn't. In answer to your question, I'm writing the book, and I come to that part in it, and I'm thinking, God, what do I do? And one of my main goals in the book was to write something that was completely honest about myself and putting myself there and being involved in stuff that, maybe wasn't so great, and I thought that's, if I sat there and wrote a book that was 580 pages of saying what a great guy this is, you're going to learn nothing about it.
Sure.
So it's in these parts that people maybe don't know about, or they didn't read about because maybe other writers didn't know about it, or could never get this information from Edward. I thought this is where you really learned about him. And so I thought him making those comments about his mother were incredibly revealing. And they originally moved out here because his mother's family, his mother had family already out here, and they were going to sponsor the Van Halens, help them and get them papers and, maybe find them work or give them places to live. Well, the family did none of that. And Edward was incredibly angry about it. And he says some things about his mother and about the mother's family. And I write about that in the book. And I had to think long and hard about including those moments, or to have fans read that and go, oh, why would you write that about him? This is Edward Van Halen, but that's the whole point, and not one person has ever said to me, my God, you're just trying to, sell a book or write those things or this and that, I go, not one person ever said that. And the reality is I could have kept out all of those moments and have written a book that was still a good book, but revealed nowhere near as much. And it would have been infinitely easier and not having to worry about, what people were going to think or say or, but that's not the book I wanted to write.
Yeah. So speaking of books, have you read the Ted Templeman book?
I haven't.
You haven't?
I haven't.
Okay. One of the questions I had here was relating to that, how your book compares to the Ted Templeman book. But I'm guessing straight up that yours is more of intimate details, as you're talking about now from those 3 a.m. phone calls, as opposed to Ted's would be more studio based, I'm guessing.
Yeah, and obviously Ted had relations with the band that nobody else had. And I know that Edward had ups and downs with Ted. He would say things about Ted, and he says in the book that were like not flattering, not positive. And then he'd bring Ted back for the next record, or a couple of records would go by, and he'd still bring Ted back. So there was obviously Ted was critical for those records, or in Edward's head he was critical. I did read parts of Noel Monk's book. And certainly Noel had a relationship with them that nobody else had. Actually, and I write about it in the book, I was actually supposed to write that book with Noel. He actually approached me initially to write Run with the Devil. And at a point in time, I kind of realized the kind of book he wanted to write. And that kind of book has validity. And, hey, he brought in another writer, and they did a fantastic job. It's just not the kind of book I wanted to write. I thought that kind of a book was, I just didn't want to be involved in that kind of book. And I think even at that time, so this was maybe, I get my history so bad. This is, I don't know, 2015, 2014. Maybe there were some thoughts in my head about writing my own book. And I thought, well, if I write this book, I can't write my book, 5 years later. I mean, that'd be ridiculous. So anyway, I passed on that book. But, there's some interesting moments in there. That one would assume are all true. So
nice. And the second part of the question from Bernie that asked that was, where can we order your book? Very important question.
Good question. There you go. So you can find the book on my website, which is very simple, tonechaserbook.com. One word, tonechaserbook.com. That's my website. So I'm guessing that your callers are calling from Australia.
That's a German friend of mine. I actually, to tell you the truth, most of my viewers are based in the States or Europe.
Oh, they are?
Yeah. About 4% of my viewers are actually Australia-based.
Interesting. Okay, so so you can get the book on my site from yes. You can get the book on my site, whether you're in Europe or Australia. So, again, shipping to Europe it's fairly expensive. I think it's about $65, but that's what the post office charges, and I make nothing on shipping. So, tonechaserbook.com. If you're over in the States for some reason, you can also find the book on Amazon, Reverb, and eBay. But you can't get the books in Europe or Australia from those sites.
Okay. Is it available as a digital version online at all?
It is. I have two audiobooks out, and they're both really amazing audiobooks. So the first audiobook, I do the main narration.
Mm-hmm.
So all the narration in the book that you're reading, it's in my voice. But all of those interviews that we've talked about, all of those Twilight tapes, I have utilized the actual interviews I did with Edward all those years ago. So there's the entire audiobook is 30 hours long. So you are hearing these unbelievable interviews with him dating back to 78. There are bits and pieces again where you're going to hear him when he's over at my pad, just noodling around. Just the noodling, to my mind, is worth the price of the book, which is $29.99. So you can find the audiobook. That's the first one. So the second one just came out, which I call Van Halen's Voices. That gathers up all of the Van Halen related interviews I've done on my YouTube page. So there's like a 5-part interview with Alex Van Halen. And these are interviews I did with Edward back in 1986 when I was working on his biography. So there's interviews with Alex, Michael, Dave, Lynn Ellsworth, who provided those early bodies and necks, Wayne Charvel Guitars, boyhood friends. There's an interview with Kevin Hill, who was Edward's boyhood friend, who was in a band called the Broken Combs with Edward when they were just like little kids. I mean, these interviews are really fantastic. And you can find both interviews on a site called mysoundwise.com. One word, M-Y, sound, S-O-U-N-D, wise, W-I-S-E.com. mysoundwise.com. And you just have to sign up for the app. And I think the first audio book is $29.99 and the second one is $14.99. So they're really amazing, man. You guys, this Van Halen stuff, all these old interviews, and you'll hear him playing my guitar, playing those, the stuff from the second and third Van Halen records. There's a part in there where he has just bought 2 Les Pauls, and he's come over to my pad with the Les Pauls, and you're going to hear him plugging into I have a Marshall stack, plugging into my stack with this Marshall and jamming for about 15 seconds. and it's going to be the most amazing guitar sound you have ever heard in your life.
Wow.
And thank goodness I had the cassette player running. So there's some great stuff. So yes, the audiobooks are out there, and I think you guys will really dig them.
That sounds amazing. That sounds like some really good content on those. Somebody's just asked me to put links to those websites below, so I will do that on YouTube after the fact.
Great.
Now, when you're saying he's coming over and he's playing, I know I've got friends who are in big bands, and I forget who they are. And then every now and then you just go, oh, that's right, you're that guy. Did you get like that with Ed? Did you kind of forget? And this is like, oh, this is my friend Ed. That's Ed Van Halen. Was those kind of moments?
Moments like that would happen.
Yep.
And those are the moments I strive for. It was just like hanging out with this guy who happened to play guitar.
Yep.
You know, I think that's what you're asking. And those moments did happen. And I think when it got sort of a lot of those deeper discussions, I think that's what it was. Because at that point in time, this is just another guy who wants to talk, and I want to reach out to somebody, you know, or, you know, we're both fucked up and we're both just having a good time. You know, I mean, certainly those discussions when I'm interviewing him for a guitar magazine, I'm realizing, hey, you know, I am a journalist, you know, as unprofessional as I may or may not be. You know, I have this gig to do, and a magazine is expecting a story. So, you know, you'd have to go through motions. But even then it was weird because I'd ask him questions that I already knew answers to. So it's like, you know, stuff we talked about. So you have to pretend that, you know, you didn't know the answer, what he was going to say. And he was always really good about that, you know.
Yep.
Even though Edward said, you know, he really didn't like to do interviews, and he didn't. I think he always gave me amazing interviews. I think he really kind of took a deeper dive. But yes, man, those are the moments I always try to reach for.
Yeah.
You know, find that balance where it's like you're not so hyper aware of who this guy is that you become tongue tied. And then those are the moments that I tend to write about in the notes section. Rosen, don't be a freaking geek in front of this guy. Why are you acting like that? You know, he's your friend. Don't keep asking him why he's your friend, because he's not going to be your friend anymore if you keep asking. You know what I mean? So it's like me psychoanalyzing myself, you know. But there were those moments. Probably not a lot, but they were there for sure.
Steve, it's been absolutely fascinating talking to you, mate. I'm looking forward to because of the shipping. I think I'll get the digital version of the book, and the audio books sound absolutely amazing with all the recordings that you have of Ed and hearing him play candidly. Man, that's a serious fan's dream right there. So I will put links to those in the description below after the fact. And I just want to say thank you so much for your time, man. It's been great talking to you.
Thanks so much. And Rick, if I was confusing, there is no digital book. It's just the audio book.
It's just the audio book. Okay, thank you for clarifying that. Yep. And that was mysoundwise.com?
Correct.
Yep.
Yeah, so you just have to download the app, and so it's there, you know, and again, so you have to remember that these interviews were recorded on cassette, and some of these interviews are dating back to 78. So quality is not always brilliant, and it's, you know, but the fact that I've never heard another audiobook do that. It's always, you know, someone reading through everything, you know. Yep. And my initial idea was, I'll just read all the interviews. You know, I'll be Steve Rosen in the interview, and then I'll read his part. I thought, that's just so dumb. It just, you know, and then I thought, hey, what if I use the original interviews? And getting that together, getting all the audio together. In fact, my friend Adam Roach, do you know Adam?
No.
You guys should meet. Adam is in Australia. He does all my audio stuff. Great guitar player. Anyway, so sending him all of the audio and having him playing it, blah, blah, blah. Anyway, so just be gentle when you hear the audiobooks. It's not all amazing quality, but I think you'll still love what you hear.
Sure. Yeah, I've just recently found online on YouTube, and forgive me if I get his name wrong, Jas Obrecht.
Jazz.
Yeah.
Jazz.
I'd read a lot of his interviews over the years
Yeah.
in Guitar Player magazine, and to actually hear the recordings of those, it's completely
Yeah.
different because you're not making it up in your head how it's being delivered. You're actually hearing it in the delivery
Yeah.
as it was intended. So
Exactly.
that's why I'm really keen to check out some of your recordings there on mysoundwise.com.
Very cool, man.
So
Very cool,
what?
Rick.
Once again, Steve, thank you so much for your time. And people, check out mysoundwise.com. Special round of applause for Steve. And I will sign off. Thank you again.
Thanks so much, Rick.